Welcome, welcome. Welcome to the luncheon lecture associated with the 21st Annual Coors Western Art Show and Sale in conjunction with the National Western Stock Show and Rodeo. What originated in 1993 by the wives and executives of Coors Brewing Company as an inauspicious sale of secondhand art has become a major happening in Denver. It combines with the Denver Art Museum to offer Winter West 3 days of events of Western art. Following today's activities and tonight's red carpet sale, the Denver Art Museum offers its full-day symposium, Western Journeys, that will examine artistic pilgrimage of various eras that left a significant mark on American history. This year, the weatherman brought the stock show weather a little bit early and has sent it on to the East Coast. While we enjoy crisp and pleasant weather, unlike 2010, when we set at that time a record in sales in spite of a raging blizzard. Let me make some introductions before we start our program, and then we'll get into our program. Today's luncheon lecture is sponsored by Carnick & Cubic, LLC, a personal finance advisory firm with offices in Denver and Colorado Springs, serving clients for over 35 years. We're very appreciative that they have sponsored this luncheon today. May I introduce the Coors Western Art Advisory Committee and ask them to stand if they're here today. It's chaired by Kathy D., I know she's here, and Nick Mathers. Rose Frederick is the curator of the show for the last 15 or 16 years. You will see the results of her work later on tonight. Paul Andrews, the CEO of the National Western Stock Show. I don't think I've seen Paul here today. Maribel Grant Award winners Henry and Lori Gordon, who embody the Western way of life and symbolize the passion of the West through art and philanthropy. We have a number of artists in attendance today. They might stand and we'll accept the panel up here. They'll get introduced later. Just to show you how many artists are participating here today. If they would, please stand. Thank you. They're the guys that make the show. Beginning last year and continuing this year, a group of younger supporters and patrons, the millennial generation, if you would, under the leadership of Amanda Boswell, established the Young Guns. The Young Guns had a warm-up event Friday night in which 150 were in attendance, and they raised $44,000 in their first ever event. These will be the next generation of patrons and advisory committee members to keep the Coors Western Art Show alive and well. Last year's red carpet sale realized $1,260,000 and $494 in total revenue, surpassing the previous year's record by 19%. Net proceeds of $254,000 went to the National Western Scholarship Trust. This trust provides over 70 financial scholarships annually to the next generation of agribusiness and rural medical leaders of the next generation. They attend the colleges in Colorado and Wyoming. Many of the students will be in attendance tonight. Take a minute to talk to them. You will be impressed. Each and every one of you who supports Coors Western Art, whether sponsor, patron, buyer, or attendee, can take pride in your support of the Scholarship Trust. Rose Frederick will be proud to announce the winners of the various awards for the show at this point.
Thanks, Bill. Welcome all. Hope you're staying warm. Looking forward to seeing you tonight. Saw a lot of you last night. So very excited about the show. A number of new things happening at the show this evening. One of them is that we have a sealed bid on 6 different works of art. A number of people have asked what that's about. So there's a starting price, and you have the opportunity to write in the amount that you are willing to pay over and above that to win that work. This is in response to actually a number of people. Maybe they had a lot to drink, but they said they would be more than willing to pay a lot more for certain works of art in the show. So we're just going to put that to the test tonight. So we have several awards in the show. The first is the Best of Show, which was selected by Christophe Hinrich and Joan Tricoli. Very excited to announce Scott Fraser Animal Farm was selected. Yay, Scott. The second award is the Southwest Art Award of Excellence that went to Don Cohen for his body of work in the 2014 Coors Western Art Exhibit. Don couldn't be here today, but congratulations, Don. The next award is Artist Choice, went to Scott Fraser. So the artist selected Scott and his body of work as their choice of favorite in the show. Congratulations again, Scott. And our final award. So this is a new award. And what we did, if you were at the preview last night, you noticed several people doing a beanbag toss. Yeah, this is the West and this is the Coors show, so we do that kind of thing. What we did is we sold $10,000 tables, and everybody who bought a $10,000 table, there were 11 folks, they all competed in a beanbag toss to win a $20,000 credit to buy one work of art. The winner is here today, Mr. Dupre. Stand up, flex those muscles for us. It got really heated up out there. It was just amazing. So what he and his wife purchased last night was this sculpture by Dan Chen, the Peacocks, and that will go, I'm understanding, to their home. And so congratulations, Dan, and thank you very much, competitors. So that's what we have for awards. And we are going to move on to our discussion. Thank you all for being here. And again, thank you, artists, for coming in, battling the weather to be at the show. I think you'll see more artists tonight at the exhibit as well. And I'm really looking forward to opening those doors and having you all come. So enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose. And thanks to the artists and the awards. Our panel discussion today is what is Western art? Wikipedia defines Western art, and you guys can challenge this, of course. Art expressions that can be considered as typical exponents of Western culture. This broad a definition of Western art could take you in many directions. Our panelists today are very diverse in their backgrounds and styles of fine art. One a naturalized U.S. citizen from Vietnam, one born in Pittsburgh and residing in Tampa, Florida, and one born, raised, and living in Utah. Between the three of them, their work is representational, impressionist, and abstract, sometimes all in the same painting. Our moderator is from Germany with a background in modern and contemporary art, and he is heading up the Denver Art Museum with the fastest growing and most ambitious collection of Western American art in the country. Let me give you some brief introductions to the panelists and to the moderator. Dean Mitchell was born in 1957 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and reared in Quincy, Florida. He is a graduate of the Columbus College of Art and Design in Columbus, Ohio. Dean is well known for his figurative works, landscapes, and still life. In addition to watercolors, he is accomplished in other mediums, including egg tempera, oils, and pastels. He has over 400 awards and honors, and I won't try to list all of them. He has been published in publications from Southwest Art to the New York Times, spanning many genres of art. He is one of the most accomplished watercolorists in the country today. Give a hand for Dean Mitchell. Kwang-Ho was born on April 30th, 1963 in Vietnam. He immigrated to the United States in 1975 and is, of course, a U.S. citizen. His artistic interest began at the early age of 3 and continued through grade school, high school, art school, and led him to a very exciting and successful painting profession. In 1980, at the age of 16, Kwang held his first one-man show at Tomorrow's Masters Gallery in Denver. In 1982, Kwang's mother was killed in a tragic auto accident, leaving him the responsibility of raising 4 children, 4 younger brothers and a 6-year-old sister. That same year, Kwang attended the Colorado Institute of Art on a national scholarship program. He studied painting under Rene Bruin, whom Kwang credits with developing the foundation for his artistic understanding. He is much sought after to give lectures and workshops around the world. He has produced a number of teaching DVDs and is currently working on a book of philosophy and work. He is widely known, popular, and respected in Denver. Many of the artists in the Coors show at one time or another studied with or under Kwang-Ho. Sharon Nevins from Fountain Green, Utah, has been painting professionally for more than 35 years. For the past 15 years, her public work has explored the imagery of horses and Western abstraction exclusively. In 2012, on the Evans remote ranch, she had a catastrophic accident involving, as she says, mules, a tall stack of hay bales, and a cell phone in a saddlebag on a by then absent mule. Sharon broke her back and pelvis severely, and her harrowing experience of near-death rescue and many months in a wheelchair and in rehabilitation have shaped a new worldview that manifests in her paintings, horses, and abstractions, and are still her means of expression, informed by her life experience and obsession with the West. Sharon was born in 1956 in Los Angeles, California. She is married to Russ Evans, and they live on their ranch outside of Fountain Green, Utah. Sharon has had a lifelong relationship with equines of all kinds and currently has 2 horses, 1 mule, and 2 burros. Sharon Evans. We'll ask them to make a brief statement in a minute, but first I would like to give the bio and introduction to Christophe Hinrich, who will be your moderator today. Christophe came to the Denver Art Museum in 2007 as curator of modern and contemporary art in 2009. And Dr. Hinrich was selected as director of the Denver Art Museum and assumed that position on January 1st, 2010. Before joining the Denver Art Museum, Hinrich was at the Hamburg Museum, one of the most important art museums in Germany. During his 13 years tenure, he organized more than 50 exhibitions, 18 of which were major loan exhibits. Since joining the DAM, he has brought a number of modern and contemporary exhibits to the Denver Art Museum, and I'll not try to list all of them. Born in Frankfurt, Germany, Hinrich attended the university in Vienna, where he studied art history and dramatics. He earned his master's and doctorate degrees at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, Germany. This university is considered one of Germany's as one of Europe's most prestigious universities. There are no greater fans of the wide Western world of art than the Germans. They even like to think that they invented cowboys and Indians. Since moving to Denver, Christophe has immersed himself in Western culture. He and his wife have settled on small acreage in Morrison, Colorado, have 5 horses, and both are avid riders. Before bringing Christophe off to moderate the panel, we'd like to kick it off if the panelists would like to make a brief statement of their own.
Looking at me first, huh?
We'll let the elders go first.
Okay, that's fine. I'll take that.
Woo.
Sure.
Actually, I'm actually really excited about this discussion because I've never quite actually thought about art as Western art. I'm an artist who looks at the environment in which I'm placed, and then I'm looking for the human experience. And I'm also looking particularly where people have migrated to a certain region of the country and seeing how they survived and what kinds of structures they lived in. And because these structures say as much about you as the place itself. And so to hear Western art, I remember I got invited to a show and I knew it was a Western art show, and I told the gentleman who called me, I won't mention the name, I just said, well, you know, I don't really do Western art. And I said, you know, and the reason I said that was because I will say that I feel that television, for the most part, has had the hugest impact on how we define what is Western art through movies and through a kind of romanticism that was not necessarily done with truth, but we grew up with this ideology. And so I think that has had a very heavy impact on what we perceive as what is Western art. So I will be interested to see how the moderator and how he weaves that concept into this discussion. It should be fascinating, I think.
That's actually probably where the Germans come in. Why I said that must be a German invention, the cowboys and Indians. And that really has to do with this notion that goes back to the 19th century. There's actually an author in Germany that everybody knows in Germany, and as well Italy and France, but nobody knows in the United States, Karl May. And he invented this saga, which goes over, I think, 28 volumes about the Wild West. He never left Saxony. His sources were really the library and the newspapers of his time and his enormous imagination, but he crafted the idea of the noble savage and the wild trappers and the people that came to the West, and crafted these wonderful characters. And when I say the Germans invented cowboys and Indians, it's, of course, not totally true, I know that, but there are probably the most ardent lovers of it, and there are certain festivals where they gather once a year to reenact the Wild West as they thought it was. So, Sharon Evans, you are a Westerner, and I think you are the only one who lives on a ranch and lives the Western life. What defines for you Western art?
Well, I was born and raised in Los Angeles, and in my heart and mind, I always was a Westerner, and imagination, I suppose. 1956, that's when I was born. My Friend Flicka, Roy Rogers. This was my imaginary world, although I may have taken it a bit farther than other people of my generation. I was always obsessed with horses, earliest memories, earliest dreams. Always thought about having land. I didn't know in My Friend Flicka that they actually shop that in 5 states worth of ranches. So there's Montana and southern Utah, Kanab area, so you have Red Rock, like it's an ultimate impossible ranch, kind of like the Germans would have designed. In their imagination, if you're gonna define ranch, My Friend Flicka made it up, and so there's no such thing really. But I always wanted to be a horsewoman, did grow up riding. We're sort of penniless kids, but we would trade cleaning stables for riding time at stables in Burbank that are now all those fancy polo fields for movie stars. So. My husband of 38 years, who's been my partner in crime for much longer than that, We left California when I was 19 and got married and came to Utah and bought a little farm, borrowed money, and we have conspired to make art and live on farms and ranches ever since. So in my mind, when I was young, I had imagined that life, and then I've lived that life. And my art has always been an outgrowth of that. I mean, the expression of the romanticized ideal that I had growing up, and then where it meets reality, you're not looking at it from a far view, but you're now living inside of it, and those are two really different things, and that's what informs my work as a Western artist.
Kwang-Ho, coming from the Far East, what means the West for you?
I like Dean, I never really thought of myself as a Western artist, but really by default, I am a Western artist. I can't help it to be affected by everything I see. You know, I get up in the morning, I look at the sky, I have in my head a whole series of sky paintings, and I don't know how to do it yet because I don't know which way to approach it, but it's there. The horses that I've been painting the last couple of years, the first time I really did a horse painting was when I visited a ranch, my friend Bill Sorens' ranch, and they actually had branding, cattle brand, which I've never seen before. So I stood on the rail and watched these people work, and I was amazed by it. So I was affected enough to do a painting. But then I didn't paint horses again until 2 years ago when I went up to another ranch with 5 other artists. We were supposed to go up there and paint the landscape. And honestly, the landscape didn't interest me that much because as I wandered down into the corral, I couldn't leave. I just looked at the horses, and they were so fascinating and beautiful. And that's how, you know, those kind of images and ideas affect the images. I mean, the horses is just an impetus, of course, for painting. The real fun is how to paint them. So I can paint them as light and shadow like Rembrandt does, or the big one at the show is almost like Matisse and Rembrandt and Sargent and everybody else put together. It's about space and those, but ultimately it's about paint.
You're so modest.
Oh, no, I didn't say that. I was comparing them. I'm just saying the idea. I'm not comparing them. But hey, if they can do it, right?
I love them.
But you know, so the concept is, it's that kind of thing that gets me excited. But that's just the start. So yes, I am excited by the things I see. You know, walking through a field, Bear Creek in Denver. It's just south of Denver. Fired my imagination to do a whole series of paintings. So I am a Western art by default. But if you were to pick me up and put me in you know, maybe back east for 5 years, then that's going to affect how I look at things too in my paintings as well.
So coming from Germany to the United States 6 years ago, one of the things that I asked myself very early was, what is Western American art? I understood it's a big deal here at the Denver Art Museum, but I try to understand what does it define Western American art? And relatively early I thought, okay, it has to do with horses, it must have to do with cows, with cattle, with the animals that you have here in the West. And I found in my collection, in the modern and contemporary collection that I was in charge of at that time, this wonderful Georgia O'Keeffe painting, Licking Cow. And I asked Thomas Smith, the curator of the Western collection, why isn't that in your collection? It's a cow. Shouldn't that be in your collection? And he just looked at me like, oh, you dummy. That is a cow from upstate New York. How could I have missed that? I mean, I apologized and said sorry. And then he explained to me, well, maybe that is not something that you could see right away, but it was done by Georgia O'Keeffe while she was living in New York in 1921, and that was pretty much like 15 years before she even got interested in the West, before she moved to New Mexico. And we had this show about a year ago of Georgia O'Keeffe in the West, where you could see actually the influence of the country, of the land, on her work. Sharon, when we briefly met in the cafe, you mentioned that this is one of your favorite paintings,
Yeah.
even if she's from New York.
Well, especially because that is the history of the West. People came here from other places, with the exception of Native Americans, which is another theme that we paint about, really. And Frederick Remington was always a resident of New York. Not everybody realizes that if they haven't followed that. He took frequent excursions to the West and certainly was there during a lot of, critically important historical things, but he always was a resident of New York. I came from Los Angeles. We all came from different places, but people sometimes are like, so Remington and Russell are considered the seminal artists of the West in many people's opinions. And Charlie Russell was an interesting one because I think he was born in Missouri, but then he came to Montana and stayed. And Maynard Dixon, born in Fresno, lived in San Francisco, and then moved to Utah and in Mount Carmel, and went back and forth between San Francisco. So that is actually the history of seminal Western artists. And so I think that, that her story mirrors the story and is one of those iconic stories of someone who was born in one place and then because of a romantic ideal and then because of coming and falling in love with the land or the way of life, came here, stayed here, painted paintings, and defined what Western art is. So to me, it doesn't make any difference whether Georgia painted in New York. One of my big influences early in my career were her watercolor paintings from about 1917. She did when she was in Texas and was teaching. And they're very loose and really textural. They evoke the West without looking like a landscape. They get the feel of it. She does a series that are on trains. And it's like there's not a single boxcar, but you have this sense, the feel of this train in this huge prairie. And that always resonated a lot with me. So Georgia could paint from anywhere and almost any subject. And to me, it resonates with this kind of Western enterprising spirit of trying to capture something.
Dean, is there for you an idea of what is Western art? Is there something that defines Western art for you as an artist?
I suppose there is. I grew up in the South, and of course I grew up around. I was raised working in tobacco, and we had barns there, and barns are is an iconic image in America, in the minds of most Americans. And tobacco barns and the barns out west are totally different. But I also grew up around horses where there were wagons in which the black African Americans worked in the fields, and we would load the tobacco on these back of these wagons that was pulled by horses to the barns for the tobacco to dry out. So, and movies really, as I said before, I was born in '57, so movies were a big, huge part of an idea of what was Western. I watched Marshall Dillon, Lone Ranger, and these types of things. But what was absent was a critical content in which how the West was explored. There was very little truth, but more romanticism than it was about the Western movement and the East Coast sort of moving to the West and basically exploring it. And at the time of their exploration, there was a lot of things that were taking place in which people were being displaced in those environments. I did not see that type of thing growing up. But when I moved to Kansas and I got invited to the Western shows, I became more fascinated with the history of how all of this emerged and how all these people came to the West and who were here before these people merged to the West and came up with this idea of Western art. And so, so we're constantly evolving and seeking truth. And so upon reading different books and seeing how people live, you begin to sort of come up with your own kind of searching for a sense of truth through the imageries that I paint now in more of a contemporary context, if that makes any sense to you.
Kwang-Ho, do you think Western art needs to be necessarily realistic, necessarily illustrative, or
Oh, no, not at all.
objective?
No, in fact, I think that's one of the things about Western art that I almost cringe sometimes when I hear the word Western art, because I know that most people think of Indians and cowboys and it becomes illustrative. But to me, the great Western work it has that feeling rather than being illustrative, like the Georgia O'Keeffe paintings and Maynard Dixon and I know when I look at a Western work, whether it has cowboys and Indians or not in it, especially when it has cowboys and Indians in it, I can almost tell when I know the artists have some sense of connection with the subject. Because once they do, they can go beyond that imagery, that illustrative quality. And when they don't, and there are many artists who cling on to the Western theme because it sells or whatever, or is popular, then it becomes illustrated. And then it becomes, to me, that's a little step away from being what art is. And so, no, not at all. I think that some of my wonderful work evokes that feeling of the West more than telling me what the West is about. And
But illustration is so much ingrained in the DNA of Western art. I mean, Remington, Russell, they were illustrators in the first place.
Mhm.
They did great illustrations for the books or the magazines, the newspapers of their time. And then some of their, I mean, it probably went back and forth, but some of their most well-known painterly inventions originally were supposed to be illustrations.
yes, I think that's because when they first saw the West as it was then, just like Bierstadt saw the West for the first time, the detail was amazing. The story of the West was amazing. So they had to put that down. But once the artists live in an area and understand the subject well enough, and if you're a real painter, you transcend that. That becomes just an idea.
Can I
Yeah,
jump
please.
in?
Oh, and here we go.
No, I just think that he's bringing up, you brought up a lot of good points in terms of the sellability of the subject. And so these artists who were great artists certainly had a certain ideology in which took such a strong grip within the psyche of American people in terms of them trying to assess what the West was, that it became so powerful in their minds that to them this was real. But this was not real what was really going on in the West. And so when you move from that idealism into the environment itself, then you become emotionally attached to the land. You become emotionally attached to the people. You become emotionally attached to the structures itself. And so then that transcends that emotional quality, that elusive, abstract thing that pulls people in and hold them and speaks a truth. A truth that is undeniable when the human experience is there in the moment of that time in which that is occurring.
Yes.
So that's a different kind of artist. It's a different kind of human being that is trying to move us forward and to share a deeper love of humanity. And that's what I think the West was about. When you look at Jackson Pollock, I mean, Jackson Pollock, he was born in Cody, Wyoming, became one of the great abstract expressionists. So where did he get all of that idea of how to break through all of the ties of Europe? Because America at that time was also searching for its own identity within the international art market. So it's all these different movements and things that are very, very fascinating. But what makes it deeper for all of us as human beings is that we connect to the spirit and the grounds in which all these things are occurring, and that's what true artists do. That's what they do.
Actually, I think it's fantastic, Dean, that you're bringing up Jackson Pollock because, of course, he is the leader of abstraction, of abex art, of the original American idea of an abstract art. On the other hand, he promoted himself and was promoted himself very much as a Westerner.
Yes.
And there is really that kind of rough blue jean, growing up in Cody, Wyoming, non-Easterner, non-art establishment image that he groomed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he saw himself, and there as well, some art historian, maybe sometimes they go a little too far, ideas that some of this throwing paint came from throwing lassos or from the dynamic and comparisons that were made between wild herds of buffalo and these swirls of paint that he was putting on a canvas, and that this actually was very much promoted through his gallerists and through art promoters as a Western voice. It's probably in no museum in this country that Jackson Pollock would be in the department of the Western American art, but there is that perception always been. So, Dean, you say definitely Western art does not have to be pictorial, illustrative.
No.
There is room for exploration of all.
Absolutely, as is there is in any type of movement. I think as human beings, we come up with a language in which we try to explain what we do and why we do it. But what is more important is the truth of what we're presenting. Sometimes we are more comfortable with romanticism because it makes us feel good. Doesn't mean that it actually gives us a sense of what was. It's only something that we put into our imagination. It's kind of like I did a series of paintings of an African-American woman. Her name was Rowena. And Rowena, though African-American, was born in Oklahoma. She traveled from Kansas to Oklahoma back and forth on covered wagons. Now, this is a painting of an African-American woman. Well, is she a Western woman because she did not have a cowboy hat on? Really? I mean, come on. You know, so there is also this symbolism that goes along with the idea of what Western is as well. And then there was Christianity that also had a huge impact upon the Native American people as well, as this movement took place in terms of pioneering and exploring the West. So there were all these different layers and layers of complex things that were taking place in terms of the railroads, in terms of the Industrial Revolution back east, and there was a Civil War. There were all these things that were taking place that all of this art started emerging out of. So it's, it's hard to define art, but I think we put labels on things because, I don't know, that's the way it is, I guess. I don't know.
Sharon, you want to say something about labels? I can see that.
I mean, I think it's interesting, and just exactly with what you're saying, putting labels on things. Years ago, and we live on a ranch that was homesteaded in the 1860s, still has lots of the original log cabins. It's very much like it would look. I mean, it's very remote, isolated, and had a lot of the original buildings, and it really keeps that flavor. The original wagon that they hauled the trees off the mountain to build the log cabins, like all those parts and pieces are still there. So the life we live, even while being very modern, I'm not trying to go back in time, we have the internet, all those things. But in my passionate love for horses and ranches and Western land, years ago I sort of made a pact with myself. Whatever means necessary, whatever it takes, whatever approach, whichever school, whichever style it takes for me to try to get at that thing that keeps me connected to my personal horses, to the idea of horses generally, Western horses on trails, riding with my amazing old cowgirl friends who are fonts of wisdom, just ask them. I will do anything. I'll do it representationally, which I have done. I'll do it entirely abstractly, which I have done. I don't think about those things, and I think we were talking about this earlier, and I think all the painters here will agree. You're not thinking about any of these things when you're painting. You're involved with all of the parts and pieces of the space that you inhabit when you're interacting with that painting. But I always said, there's going to be no boundaries. There was a place where I'm like, I'm not going to try to be anything for anybody. I'm going to try to get at the heart and soul of what I love about this land, what's mystical and magical about it for me, what it's like to ride a horse that I've trained into backcountry that almost nobody's seen. Like, those are magical things. So the genre, the style, the type, I do go through phases where I try it and I decide later if I had lesser or better success based on whether it was a true representation of how I feel. So, like, I have a very abstract piece that I think that there's an image of, and it's really a portrait of our ranch. And I was asked all night last night, there must be a horse in there somewhere. I'm like, well, I didn't mean there to be, but if you see there's one there, maybe you're right.
Sharon, how large is your ranch?
A couple 100 acres, and we live in the middle of other parcels that are several thousand acres, and then it's up against mountains that are all Forest Service. So it's really in the middle of nowhere. And before we lived there, and this is a really important element and component that is in that painting, It was the wintering grounds of the Sandpitch Indian tribe, which were entirely displaced in various ways, some terrible ways, and some ways that were not as terrible, but nevertheless were entirely displaced. There is, outside my studio window, about 8 feet, there is a long grinding stone, about 10 feet long and about 2 feet wide, with a deep groove in it. The snow doesn't even cover it for some reason. Like it melts over the top of this stone. I mean, I see it at all times in my studio. Always conscious of the long layers of history that exist on that ranch. We're just my husband and I and our family, we're making memories there right now. Our grandchildren who live on the East Coast in Baltimore are obsessed with the ranch. They're obsessed with it. They love the ranch. And we are just layers of people and inhabitants. We're one more layer, and there'll be people after us. And that's what that painting is about. And it's the truest way that I could paint that without, I don't have to always paint the mountains or that grindstone. There are references to the inhabitants before us and other things that are in there.
So Western American art is defined by the experience of the land, of the West, but as well by the history. So you're saying it's an encounter.
Critically entwined. I mean, to ignore that is to do so at your own peril as an artist.
Kwang-Ho, how is that something in your work that is inspiring or that you meet in your work?
Well, I think that's interesting. When I listen to Sharon, I realize I don't have that kind of experience. I feel homeless, actually. But it's good, in a good way. And I mean, I'm kind of the whole, I remember going to France. I took a group of artists over there to paint. We were teaching a workshop. And I realized France is beautiful everywhere you go, but I couldn't paint for a week. None of the paintings turn out. And it's beautiful, it's there. I can see the aesthetic prettiness of it, but I couldn't paint it. Then a couple years later, I went back to Vietnam. First time I've been back in 20 years since I left as a little boy. And the paintings just painted themselves. I know what it felt like. I didn't even have to fight the painting at all. Because it was connected, and that's the connection that you're talking about, Sharon. But now, in my experience, I'm very detached from that. It's more about the visual. It's about what is it to make art. And so the experience that I see, the visualness, the visual stimulation, there's some layer underneath it that has to fire my imagination and a heart connection. Like I'm talking about the sky. It intrigues me. And I see it every day, so it starts to kind of brew in my head. And but when I walk the land, I don't have that connection that you're talking about. I'll see the dirt and say, that's beautiful dirt. Or I see rocks. And there's a painting that I have in the show. It's a small one called Hillside at a Glance. And it's very abstracted. And it's just patterns of snow against rock. And I realize I drive up the mountain and I see that all the time. Then all of a sudden, I see it as a painting. And then I realize I can paint that painting super realistically, really big, or I can do it as paint. And so that's just one way of painting it. So these ideas come at me, and I can see it becomes like, how many different ways can you do it? And each way to do it is just having fun. It's diving into it, see what paint can do. So in that sense, the West, to me, it's because I'm here all the time. And I love looking at Western work done by artists who've lived here, who knows about this land, who knows about the people who live here, and what the land feels like. Victor Higgins down from Taos has done some paintings that are just amazingly Taos, you know. And but then you can also spot a painting that's just Western and it doesn't go any deeper than that, and that doesn't intrigue me so much.
I mean, it has something to say that all these guys have German roots. Higgins, Ufer, Hennings. I mean, it is really ingrained somewhere. Everybody's coming from somewhere, but of course there was, I don't want to exaggerate that, but there was some German longing or some idea of what the West could be that particularly some painters of the Taos school followed or had in their history. Dean, does the history of the West play a particular role for you as a Southerner?
Yeah, I think it does. For example, when I first got invited to a lot of the Western shows, I stayed in Kansas for about 25 years. And for a long time, I never really painted a snow scene. It took me a number of years, so although you've seen quite a few of my snow scenes of the West. But I had lived there quite a while before I even explored doing any type of snow scenes. But upon one of the shows in the West that I got invited to, a friend of mine took me to the Pima Maricopa Reservation, which is right outside of Phoenix, and I was just, it was like my childhood had revisited me all over again, except these were Native Americans and Hispanics, and I thought, wow, this is fascinating. All this poverty, all of this, what is happening here? And I thought, this is something I shall paint and explore. And I thought, it's not romantic, it's just something that just is. And is this the repercussions of history? And so I look at the things that we wrestle with in terms of education, in terms of opportunity, in terms of availability to certain things, and I looked at that and I thought, could this be a window into a kind of dialogue that these images may possibly create to heal some wounds of the past of history? And how do we explore these places that are still now amongst us in a contemporary way, and we're seeing this before our eyes? How can I, as an artist, go into this environment that I know very little about other than my emotional pull to it because it reminded me of my hometown? Could I possibly resonate through my images a power that will pull people in and make them think about those historical things that truly happened in the West and what happened to these people, and how do we break the chains of romanticism and then begin to present a truth about the West and move forward out of all of this? How do we do that? And in fact, when I was in a show, I met a gentleman whose work was traveling. He was African American, and the work was coming from the African American Los Angeles Museum, and I had been invited to be a part of a show that he was putting together for the Florida State Capitol and the governor, and he didn't have enough work to round the show off, so they invited me to round the show off, and I got a chance to meet him, and I said, I understand your show coming from the African American Los Angeles Museum. He said, yes. I said, I'm in a show out in that area. He said, where at? And I said, the Archery. And he looked at me and said, Archery? And I said, well, yeah. He said, what kind of images are you doing for the Archery? He's looking at me. He's African American. I'm African American. And so I tried to explain to him. And because there is, even within the core of the African American experience, there are artists who explore what they call the African American experience in regards to American culture. I am an artist who have constantly said I am an American artist, but by far I am an artist first. But it's all the same. The human experience and what we are wrestling with is all the same. And so it's just really hard for me as a human being to categorize in my own mind, although I understand why we do it. But for me as a painter, I am just in search of truth through that imagery and through that land. Be it negative, be it, and in some ways, exploring the reservation pieces, it was not to make someone feel guilty about history or how they inherited their wealth. That was the least thing on my mind. What was on my mind was, how do we, as human beings, look upon each other with some sense of sensibility to why things are still reoccurring, and how do we make lives better through the arts and touch people in a way where we, I don't know if this is making sense.
It is. Keep going.
It's just that I'm just looking for a honesty and a truth about what occurred. And I have that same problem within the African American experience, because I heard somebody say, whoa, Dean Mitchell, isn't that the black guy that kind of paints like white people?
Oh my God.
This is what's said about being the black community. And this happened to Henry Tanner, you know. But when I look at great artists, when I look at Picasso and all these great artists, you know, when photography came into being, they explored, they looked at other cultures, they pulled from things, but they were looking at the human experience. And I think that's what great art comes out of. I think it comes out of an experience. And unless you have that experience, you cannot create great art. You can create imaginative, beautiful pictures that are pretty. You can do that, and people will like them. But they will not challenge them to better our world. They will not challenge them how to better our world. And I think it's artists. Artists have always challenged us. If you look at the musicians of our time, they challenge us. Jazz was demonized at a time when it first emerged on the scene. You know, and now it's celebrated. What, when Marcella's at the Lincoln Center, jazz at the Lincoln Center, you know? And so you look at, even when you look at hip hop, I mean, there's just all these things. But the rawness of it, out of the rawness comes truth. And sometimes that truth reflected back to us in the comforts of our home may be discomforting to us, but it is raw and it is real, and it is in our reality that we have to deal with it. And how do we deal with it? We deal with it through truth and through honesty and through art. It is the universal language that makes us human. That's what it does.
One last question to the three. One last question to the three artists on the panel before I'd like to open it to the audience. How has being labeled or named or included in the community of Western artists affected your career? Sharon?
Oh, I'd love to talk about that because I've had to sort of fight for my membership. I have to be the one who keeps asserting, oh, I'm a Western artist. And sometimes other people say, you're not a Western artist because your approach is not like, you know, the people that we are familiar with. And so then I have to sort of assert my credentials. Well, I'm a horsewoman. I train draft mules and sometimes have bad things happen in the process of that. I have, you know, worked as a volunteer generaling Mustangs. We've done all of the ranch stuff. And so then people are more apt to say, oh, well, okay, then you can come into our community. But now that I feel like I've always been integrated in that way, and I have felt like, well, for the last 15 years that the art community has generally accepted me as being integrated in that way, where they accept, first they do sort of need my credentials as being a Westerner, a rancher, and then they begin to see it. And I feel like it has been a wonderful addition to the career part of being an artist, because I think it gives people who love Western art but who are looking for some broadening of the way in which they have seen it, it gives them something else to look at home. And my collectors have talked about their connections to the work, which I always find really meaningful, because I think that I have a little narrower niche than some Western artists, but the niche that I have are pretty ferocious, interesting, risk-taking kind of people, which is sort of the spirit of the West. It's what it was when Bierstadt and Moran went and painted their paintings, and were all of the iconic Western paintings. That was the spirit of it. I mean, personally, I'd like to pay tribute to Rose Frederick, because that's the spirit that she has brought to the National Western. It makes me a little emotional. She's put herself out on the line to really broaden the definition in one location for 2 weeks of what Western art is. And it is the experience of all three of us with our diverse stories and diverse backgrounds of expressing what's true to us living in the West in 2014. I'm not trying to go back to the 1890s. I fight a fight every day, and I think each of us talk about this. I have a personal fight my husband and I fight, which is to rescue horses and to try to educate people about how to take care of their horses in 2014, where they are a total luxury now. They are no longer a necessity. That's just that's a personal thing for us. And so I hope that kind of answers your question. Oh, don't let me get started on horses. Wait, where's David Griffin? I said, if anything gets weird, he's supposed to jump up and ask me a technical question about horse hooves if I start to get lost about art.
Kwang-Ho, how has it been affecting your career?
I don't know if I've ever heard anyone call me a Western artist. So, and I think that would be a little bit similar to somebody who looks at me and said, well, you're a Buddhist, something like that, or I was thinking about this. This is kind of offbeat, but you think about if I label myself as a Western artist or any kind of artist, and I love what Dean was saying about getting to the truth of it. And so, what in the world does that mean as an artist, But that's really the most important thing. I was being interviewed one time on air with the microphone in my face and the camera rolling, and the interviewer said, "What is art?"
Oh my God.
I'm like, but spontaneously, after a couple of seconds, I said, well, I think art is a byproduct of your search for what is true. And I don't think I've come up with a better answer since then, because which implies that everything you do, whatever style you approach, whatever you paint, however you do it, if you do it with a searching intention, implying that you're not painting for the market or the museum or the gallery or whatever, there's truth in it. It's art. It's like when you look at Van Gogh's recent show, all the things that he did, they were terrible paintings for a number of years before he found the Japanese prints and really understood that, this is what I'm not about Rembrandt type of painting. But so it's that search, even if you're really bad along the way, but if it's honest, it's art. So to me, that's that whole search. So I haven't been labeled that yet. But I think it would be great fun just for a few years just to call myself a Western artist and do some Western art.
Go for it.
So it'll be something the years to come, right? Dean, you already mentioned your friend or colleague who was confused that you're exhibiting at the Autry Museum.
That's right.
But did you have to live with the label of Western American artist or artist of the West?
Never. It's really been the African American thing has really been for me. It's been the label, and I have and I have on purpose gone out of my way to explore people's idea of what that is, and so. But what I do enjoy about being in the West is that it has broadened my history of America and how all of this took place. And so in that regard, it has enriched my life, as has the experience of going to Fort Scott in Kansas when I found out some of the first African-American troops who engaged in the Civil War officially as black soldiers were at Fort Scott. And so that deep history resonated with me because that was a history that I did not learn about. And so there are a number of things that I have learned by being a part of these shows in terms of looking at something that is spoken with truth versus looking at something that has been done for a marketplace that is sellable to a certain group of collectors. Now, I do think that the artist, and every artist has wrestled with this, do I continue to do something because I know it sells and because I need to support myself and my family? Or do I challenge them? Do I challenge them to move forward and to look at art with a deeper aesthetics? Because that's where the enrichedness comes. That's the experience truly that they're really searching for. But sometimes people get into, I don't know if you've seen people that it has to be a certain thing, a certain style, a certain look. But I do think by artists exploring different things, and I think the way Rose is presenting the show, it will, I believe, inform the collector that there are so many different ways to look at the West. And I'm just a small part of that microcosm of that. And I bring my own history, Southern history, and intellectual baggage, and I will say that, based on my own upbringing in terms of my own Christian background and different things, and how things are presented. Sometimes because they are popular and they catch on does not necessarily mean that they are true. But the true artist is searching for that, and that's what I'm about. I'm for searching wherever I'm at, and whoever extends an invitation to me to show my work so that the public can see it. God bless them, I'm here. So, thanks, Rose.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dean. I'd like to open to the audience. Are there questions? Yes.
You're doing great, girl.
So the question is, what percentage is connected with the historic, nostalgic idea of the West, and what percentage is more a contemporary approach or a more formally open approach?
Was
You
this
have any
addressed to
idea?
any of us specifically? I would love to
Just
answer.
go ahead.
I think that there is a really great place, so I would want to be careful that I wasn't characterized as being anti-traditional. I think that there is a very important place in all art genres for a place of peace, of just looking back, a place where you can look at a painting and just breathe deep and say, isn't that a beautiful place? Or that reminds me of something special in my memory. Or even, I hope there's a place like that somewhere. Whatever that truth is for a person, I think that's a really important, in our search for truth, it doesn't mean we always have to like push ugliness or other, that's certainly, there's a place for that too. So I personally find a lot of peace in Thomas Moran paintings. I always have. Bierstadt is a sort of controversial figure because he so romanticized it, but I actually have always loved his work. I empathize with it because when I get those like love endorphins going from my land and horses and stuff, I could love to paint real romantically, and I have done that too. And I think if you were in the if you were in Yosemite and nobody had ever, from the East, had ever really seen it, I think that the way that he showed that to people before cameras was pretty amazing, and I still love to look at his work, and I think it's sad that within his life it became unappreciated or out of fashion. So I think there's a real place for sentimental work in a way. That word can be sometimes vilified, but I don't think it should be the only thing. One of the many choices that people have in Western art.
Kwang-Ho, Dean, anything to add?
Wow, after that answer,
Yeah,
I'm not
that's
sure.
you.
Okay.
She covered it
I
well.
think the key word there is love. If you have a real love for what you're doing, then you do that. But then that will always come across in art. And whether you approach it intellectually or emotionally, I use this to explain art. I read this art book a long time ago, and I use this when I teach, called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Most of it went right over my head, but there was one thing he explained about beauty that really stuck with me. And at that point, I was a young artist and didn't know how to explain a good painting when I saw it. And he said, there's two sides to beauty. There's one, emotional response. No, response to beauty. One is emotional, which he calls romantic beauty, and the other is classical beauty. And romantic beauty is about responding to something purely on an emotional level. You just love a sunset, you love red, you love whatever. And I realize on that level, it's always correct. Your response to that love is always correct. But the other side, the mechanical beauty, is responding to the structural makeup of something, like how the painting is done. And he used a motorcycle for the first time. He explained it as if I saw this gleaming, beautiful chrome motorcycle, and I don't know anything about motorcycles, except how cool I would look on that, then I gotta buy it. So emotionally, I respond to it and buy it. But Dean comes along, he knows something about how a bike is put together, and he looks at the same bike and says, that's a piece of junk. You drive that around 5 blocks, it's gonna fall apart on you, don't buy it. So he didn't see what I saw, you see. So as an artist, when I look at a painting, I look at it on the mechanical level. As an artist, when I paint, I have to have a romantic attachment to what I paint, but as soon as I put it down on canvas, it becomes a mechanical process. And that has a beauty that is really mysterious. And that's why Dievenkorn is one of my favorite artists. Richard de Kooning is one of my favorite painters, right along with John Singer Sargent. And I can explain those to a layperson on the mechanical side. But on what you fall in love with, there's no wrong answer there. So, but you have to have that as your artist.
Other questions? Yes, over there. Oh, is it? Really?
Oh my God.
Did everybody understand the question? Yeah.
No? Can you read?
Okay, the question was, what is your thought about the public art in Denver that is mostly, or in many cases, Western themed or coming with a Western spirit?
I think it's not surprising that the art becomes Western themed because there is some politics involved in choosing the work, because whoever chooses the work has to think about where it's going and so on and so forth. I'm really glad there's public art, obviously. I think it's wonderful to have art anywhere at all. I don't apply for those kind of things, even though I wouldn't mind doing them, but because I know there's a politics involved in that. And as an artist, I just like to just, if I were to be given a project like that, then it becomes like a fun project to see how I can get at it, And like Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel certainly has parameters to work within, and he did just fine. So, but I'm glad to see it. Even that crazy blue horse. At first, I didn't like it at all. It seems awkward and weird, but I like the weirdness of it now.
I think that it's. I've served on a few public things like that where we've had to look at a group of artists and select. But I do know there is, as he said, there are politics, and there's also the funding, who's funding it, and there is a theme in mind in which there may be certain guidelines in which they have to abide by. And so there's also that kind of limitation. And so, I think, but I do think that as people look around, I think each city, if you look at how we are socialized, there are cities who are looking for a certain identity so that they can, because art is also woven into our economy. So we're also trying to woo people to come to our city that has something different to present than other cities. And so you try to find something that you feel that will be indigenous to that region that will pull that audience. And New York is no different, as is California, any other place. They look for something that will set them aside and make them unique, because we are, if you look around, sometimes, I know when I was exploring the idea of presenting urban America in the West, people say, well, it looks like it could be in New York, it could be in California, it could be anywhere. And so, so I think that there's certain sculptures that can kind of differentiate a certain region, because we are becoming more, if you look around, the malls, they all look the same. You have this kind of commercialism that's taken place that is making a lot of things the same. And so this is what struck me so unique about New Orleans. It was a city within a city that was unique. It had a unique flavor. And so now, when you go to the suburbs, everything is out like we call them cookie cutters. Although they're beautiful, they all look, there's a certain sameness. So I do think that cities are looking for, when they put these prizes together, they are looking for ways to present themselves uniquely. So I think that also comes into play. It's just my thought.
Who doesn't?
Yeah.
Who wouldn't
I
love
love the
blue
sculpture
bear?
here, right here, and I love the horse too.
And actually, I think it always looked at it as a big quality of the city and the sculpture program in Denver, that it is has a profile, that it is reflecting, and sometimes really tongue-in-cheek, reflecting the idea of the West, the idea of space, the idea of largesse, grandeur, but as well some of the mythology of the West, and is not like in other cities where, the term drop and plop sculpture was forged, I think, in the 70s, early 80s, where you sort of could have your Botero in every pedestrian zone, or it really became a little, you didn't really know, are you in New York, or are you in Chicago, or are you in Denver? And I think Denver really avoided this drop and plop philosophy in a very smart, and me as a greenhorn and somebody who's really new in that city, always some program that I loved and that I identified strongly with Denver. Other questions? Yes.
So I've been on the Coors committee for a while, and one of the fun things is really when someone walks into the gallery and says, "What is that doing here?" or "Why is that in a Western art show?" And I think to speak to Dean's point, I mean, Dean, I think your pieces really speak to a sense of place, and I think that's eminently Western. I think that transcends it, and so one of the interesting things is Rose not high. It's sort of how do you define Western by including things in a Western show? I mean, that in and of itself sort of pushes folks to say, why is that here? And I think that's really cool, and I'm kind of feel like that is the answer. So it's fun.
Other questions? Yes.
Well, just as you were speaking of the brand, I was thinking about the beautiful painting of smelting works in Denver, and that was making me think that the cattle industry was an industry. And then I was thinking that with complexity and meaning that you guys are talking about, could you do drilling rigs? Could you do wind turbines?
Oh, where's Joe? She's the drilling rig painter.
How those can help us get out of the demonizing thing. I mean, maybe suburban houses, either by natural gas. Yes,
Also, Don Stinson, if he's here, he could speak to that well.
But you talked a little bit about how the kinds of things you're talking about could be helping us get out of the stupid wrangling over public policy on these issues. I think so much of what you were just saying, I have to do I'm going to go out directing all the time, and if I had these works with me, I will say,
Excellent. You owe me, Joe.
positively polarized political world and decision-making world, the kind of art you're talking about, how could that boot us out of these ruts?
Well, I think those artists, Don and Joe and other people who are painting uniquely Western works and including those kind of, the old drive-in, I love that piece, the drive-in, his work of a couple of years ago, I believe, that had the telephone poles, and still the Western environment, the prairie look behind it. Joe's drilling rig from I think 2 years ago, she is I don't know, I don't want to define you as a photorealist, but very realistic work, and her care in all of the ways in which she portrays that, and Don's as well. I mean, these are the two that just occur to me quickly. I'm sure there's many more. Are showing sort of like the loving care of that form, the form of what that looks like on our real landscape. Once again, it's sort of like acknowledging we live in 2014. This is what our world looks like. And so, yes, you can turn your lens towards just the mountain and paint just that, or you can turn your lens the other direction in which there's a highway and a road and a convenient stop and all that sort of thing. And I think it completely has that place as absolutely folded in the center of Western art and the tradition of Western art.
One last question. Yes.
This is for you, Dr. Hinrich.
Oops.
In terms of the German appreciation for American Western art.
Bierstadt, by the way, another one.
That's right. Yeah, it's true.
Hey,
It's true. Great painter.
He was a
Dusseldorf, yeah.
trained academician, and you had a number of the Western school painters that were trained in Germany. Is the German appreciation coming from that, or is it coming from Karl Wagner, or is it coming from American television and movies?
All of it. All of it. But probably the oldest source is Karl May, which was in the late 1800s, pretty much the time of Ludwig II, the Swanstein, whatever you pronounce it, castle king, and a very romantic idea of the West, of the as I said, the noble savage. And I think that is probably the starting point. But then, of course, it's in my generation, it's as much forged and ingrained through TV shows and Dallas. And by the way, a modern West is Dynasty, which in Germany is called the Denver Clan. So when I moved to Denver, a lot of people were mixing it up and were asking me, when do you go to Dallas? So the oil rigs and the the more contemporary face of the West, of course, plays a big role, I think, in not in the art, in what you guys do, in the perception of the West. I think in general there's one thing, and that is different, and that is space. And when I walked through the show yesterday, I really thought about space, and that gives you a different feeling when you live in the West. And coming back to the wonderful introduction that Bill gave, for me, he mentioned that I live on small acreage. And that was sort of a little insider joke between him and me, because my wife and I, we found a wonderful property, and there were 8 deer living in the corral. It's a horse property, and 8 deer were living there because the property was left empty, and we called the house 8 Deer Ranch. And a little later, and we made a beautiful wooden sign, 8 Deer Ranch. A little later, a trustee of mine came and saw that and asked me, he has a ranch like 30,000 acres. And he asked me, so how many acres do you have? And I said, 20. And he said, well, maybe that's more a ranchette you have here. And it never occurred to us that calling this lovely home with this lovely corral and these lovely 8 deer could be perceived as presumptuous. And we always thought, darn, 20 acres, that is so much. We never could even afford this anywhere else. And living with the space, I always joke and say, my walk-in closet is as large as my whole apartment would be if I would live in New York. Living with that space and living with the idea of extension, living with the grandeur, the sublime of the West, of course, is something that you meet in many of your works, and works that even look very abstract, very contemporary, very non-Remington, non-Russell, non-pictorial-like, and I think that might be really a part of the essence of the West. Thank you very much to the panel. Sharon, Kwang-Ho, Dean, thank you very much. And it was a pleasure to get your ideas and have a wonderful Western show now.
Thank you very much.
Good job.
Thank you again, Christophe. That was amazing. I'm so glad you could be here to be our moderator today, and thank you, artists. And I would like to, one last time, artists of the Coors Show, would you please stand up? And the reason I'd like you all to stand up is because for everyone else in the audience, Patty, feel free to grab any of them. Get them. Joe, I don't know if you have a painting that doesn't have horse manure in it, do you? So, but artists, could you just please stand up so you could be recognized by our audience? And thank you. And the other reason I wanted these artists to stand up is because any and all of them could have been up here on this panel discussion, and you would have heard many marvelous things. I've learned so much just listening to you all, as I always do. So when you run into these artists later on or throughout the show or any time, pick their brains too, because they all have very unique perspectives. You know, Willie, Howard, Duke. I mean, can you put the horse away, Duke, please, and paint? I mean, so all of our artists in the
resist.
I feel the thing that really binds all of the artists in the Coors Show together is they're authentic and they're honest and they're real and true artists. So thank you, artists, from the bottom of my heart for bringing the very best work to the Coors Show and really putting us on the map. So thank you all for coming.
Rose.
Thank you, Rose.